Okay, it looks like the numbers have settled. I hope those that did go on a coffee run are back at your desks in front of your screen now. I would like to thank everyone first and foremost for joining us this morning. We're very excited to be here. My name is Jeff Collins, and I am the Business Development and Marketing Manager for the Gowling's Waterloo office. Our discussion today promises to be an interesting one as our colleagues Chris and Tushar take you through workplace vaccination policies. For those of you who've attended some of our previous virtual Oatmeal sessions, you'll find that our setup for the session is slightly different. Due to the number of people attending today, we have switched to a presentation style, which means that your microphones are muted and will stay muted throughout the presentation. Of course, we do welcome all the questions that you have and encourage you to write them into the Q&A section, which I will be moderating and then asking our presenters at the end of the question. I'll do my best to get all the questions you have answered. However, if any are missed, please feel free to reach out directly to either Chris or Tushar, whose contact information can be both found online on our website as well at the end of this presentation. If you wish your question to be anonymous, there is a little box that you can tick within the Q&A section that will hide your identity. So without further ado, and because we do have a packed presentation and I'm sure lots of questions, I'd like to introduce you to Tushar Anand Sagar, who will start by taking us through the sources of authority for workplace vaccinations. For those that don't know Tushar, he's an associate in our Gowling's Waterloo office and works with clients on a broad range of human resources matters. When asked what he'd be if he was not a lawyer, Tushar responded that he would drive race cars for a living, assuming someone would hire him, which makes me think that he spent too much time in his quarantine watching that F1 documentary on Netflix. Tushar, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And we did not talk about Drive to Survive. And yes, I have. I've watched it too many times. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. I'm really happy to be here presenting to you. And I'm looking forward to some really interesting questions, hopefully a couple of curveballs in there. I'd like to start off by just walking a little bit through the agenda today and, promise to be brief. Number one, we'll cover off sources of authority for workplace vaccination policies. Number two, risks of mandatory vaccination policies. Number three, risks of no policy. So what happens if you don't have a policy, and maybe a little bit of an offshoot of that, vaccination incentives. And then number four, practical issues going forward into the future. So as promised, sources of authority for a workplace vaccination policy. We'll start off by looking at the primary justification for a workplace vaccination policy. When these issues are discussed in law, the starting point usually is health and safety. And so for Ontario employers, that would be the Occupational Health and Safety Act. There's a provision under the Occupational Health and Safety Act which states that an employer is responsible for, quote unquote, taking every precaution reasonable in the circumstances. The reason that the legislature has included that language is because the OHSA is designed to be forward-facing. It is designed to consider issues that are not sort of present tense. We are looking at where things will be, not just where they are now. If we look at the legislation and some of the changes that have happened over the course of the past decades, the legislation has reacted and the courts have reacted to evolving issues that allow for maximum protection, every precaution reasonable in circumstances, for workers in workplaces throughout the country, and most particularly in Ontario now. So I would say at this stage, under the OHSA, we have no legislation requiring vaccination, not yet. We have a look at the situation over in other countries where these steps have been taken under similar statutory regimes where they have an internal responsibility system where an employer is responsible for taking these same precautions that are reasonable in the circumstances. Countries where the situation with COVID-19 is more severe, and we do see that the legislative changes and responses from the regulators, we're looking directly at the US now, have been quite different. The situation with respect to COVID-19 in the US, in excess of 500,000 in terms of the death toll, they're much more significant. Larger population, but more severe in terms of consequences. And so we ask a general question at this stage, and this is an evolving issue we don't really have the full answer to. Could a more severe response be warranted if the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic become more significant in Ontario? And you know, it's possible. There's a possibility there. No expectation at this time for the legislative change to be put forward, but it is possible. I'd like to look at a couple of parallel situations, if we can, that sort of mirror the approach that we're seeing with respect to vaccination in other jurisdictions where employers in the private sector have been told, hey, it's okay to do this and to impose a mandatory vaccination policy. We look at school children, particularly in the public sector, in the public system. Unless a child has a valid exemption, and we're talking about religious or medical exemptions, the children who attend at a primary or a secondary school in the province of Ontario, or public school, must be immunized, right? Must be immunized. And this is a partial list I'm just going to read off here. Diphtheria, tetanus, polio, measles, mumps, rubella, meningitis, whooping cough, and chickenpox or varicella for children that are born in 2010 or later. Again, that's a partial list. And this has evolved over time, but it's under legislation, it's under law. What do parents have to do in response to these issues? Based on the province's website here, and I'm quoting directly, provide proof of your child's immunization to the local public health unit. Keep immunization information up to date. Children who do not get immunized are at increased risk of disease. They may be removed from school during a disease outbreak, right? If we look at daycare centers, there are parallels there as well. I'll read off the list again. Tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, Tdap, not sure what that is, measles, mumps, rubella, varicella, and hepatitis B. And what is the justification in both of these contexts? We look at that first bullet point there, occupational health and safety, workplace health and safety, the general health and safety of individuals that are in that environment. So what can we glean from case law that relates specifically to workplaces as we look for sources of authority in this changing time? Well, we have a couple of mixed results, a couple of key points that I'll sort of fire off before we look at specifics within the case law. We have unionized workplaces where these issues have come up primarily, I will say. And the reason for that is that there's a lot more litigation coming out of a unionized setting rather than a non-union setting with respect to policies specifically. Unions, they tend to be more sort of attuned to what is changing in terms of a policy and how it applies to the general populace. Some of the most significant charter cases, for instance, coming out of the last 2 decades have been unionized workplace settings, the ones that we'll discuss a little bit later on in the presentation. Another key point is, generally speaking, they tend to be either healthcare settings or congregate living settings. And so we're talking about hospitals, we're talking about long-term care facilities and the like. And then finally, the last piece is, these cases dealt with vaccinate or mask, and they may not be sufficiently relevant to COVID-19, where we may be looking at a framework now, particularly based on the Health Canada resources, the Public Health Ontario resources that say vaccinate and mask. For individuals that have been vaccinated, the expectation is they will continue to mask to safeguard those that haven't been vaccinated. A couple of key points from the cases, and I'll move through them quickly. I don't want to bore everybody with case law. 2008, we have this North Bay Hospital case. So the arbitrator in that case upheld a mandatory vaccination requirement that was imposed by the employer. In that particular case, the Ministry of Health came in and said, we are recommending to you, employer, that you take steps to implement influenza containment measures in response to a minor outbreak, a pocket outbreak in that particular facility. Several nurses refused, and they were placed on an unpaid leave due to their absences from the workplace because they refused to be vaccinated. And in that particular context, with the Ministry of Labor standing at the doorstep saying, we are recommending that this is the course of action going forward, the policy was actually upheld. So that was a key distinction factor there. 2011 through 2013, we're going to move more so into the vaccinator mask, that final bullet point there, case law. And so we have this BC Health decision. What is BC Health about? So the arbitrator in this case upheld a policy that said vaccinate or mask. So you either prove that you've been vaccinated, right? To get vaccinated, prove you've been vaccinated. The proof of vaccination has to be sufficient for the employer. Or if you want to opt out of this particular system, you have to wear a mask at all times while you're in the workplace and dealing with individuals that could be at risk of transmission. Again, we're talking about influenza here, not the COVID-19 virus. And so, the vaccinate or mask policy, it was actually implemented for the same reasons that we talked about in that first slide: health and safety. There were low rates of immunization, high rates of absenteeism, and a high rate of transmission between employees of hospitals, plural, and their patients. The policy also found that an individual employee who did not comply with the vaccinate opt-in or mask opt-out framework could be subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination of employment. And so there's the hammer that's putting the nail into the wood. We are looking at a situation where an individual could be vaccinated or masked, and if they didn't comply, they could be subject to discipline up to and including the loss of employment in the union sector. And if we look at the reasoning that came out of that case, I think it's really critical in these times, because I do think that the BC Health case is probably the most relevant and helpful as we move forward and look to whether or not this will be permissible during COVID-19. The arbitrator found that this vaccinate or mask policy was reasonable for 5 key reasons. Number one, the arbitrator considered expert evidence. Some of the names that were found in that case in 2013 in the arbitrator's decision are actually leaders of our current public health units in Ontario and across the country. So they considered expert evidence, and it weighed in favor of the fact that immunization of healthcare workers was actually a factor in reduction of transmission of the disease. And I'd like to factor in that, we do have some promising results coming out of Israel, for instance, and initial studies on vaccination from countries, Denmark, Israel, that are saying that the higher the rates of vaccination are, the lower the risk of transmission. So that could be a parallel between the current situation and BC Health. Based on the expert evidence, number 2, masking had a patient safety purpose and effect, and it's sufficiently accommodated through that opt-out system, accommodated healthcare workers who conscientiously objected to vaccination per se. So religious accommodations, medical accommodations, allergies, the accommodation framework was built into the policy. Number 3, the policy itself was not discriminatory because it didn't force, it had that opt-out option, immunization. It actually allowed employees to choose one or the other. And the employees had an option to wear a mask instead. And then I think a critical factor in that particular case was the BC Center for Disease Control, not to be confused with the US CDC. So the BC CDC had endorsed the employer's policy framework, this vaccinate or mask policy framework, and said, scientifically, this policy will reduce transmission, it will improve patient safety, and it will generally improve the risk of transmission and a reduction of harm in the workplace. And so, for those reasons, the arbitrator upheld the vaccination or mask, the VOM, as we call it, policy. Fast forward to 2015, we have a Sioux area hospital case in Ontario where the exact opposite happened, but there were a couple of key differentiating features. The policy itself was not supported by a regulator. It wasn't supported by the BC CDC or Public Health Ontario or the province or the Ministry of Labor standing at the door. And so the outcome in that case was exactly the opposite of what happened in BC. The arbitrator ruled that the policy itself was unreasonable and unsupported and constituted a violation of individual rights. And so not super helpful from the standpoint of an employer seeking to reduce harm. I think the same analysis and the same approach came up in 2018, which was likely the most recent decision that would have factored into this vaccinate or mask framework before the COVID-19 pandemic came. And that was the St. Mike's Hospital versus ONA, Ontario Nurses Association I'm going to call it a marathon, 60 days of hearing. And the arbitrator found that there was a lack of scientific evidence in favor of masks, And therefore, the issue was characterized in the following manner. I'll read this quickly. The question is whether the evidence supports the conclusion that the use of surgical or procedural masks worn by unvaccinated healthcare workers for some or all of the flu season actually results in reduction of harm to patients? Question mark. Does it prevent the transmission of illness? Question mark. Does it save lives? Question mark. If the VOM policy prevented patient illness and saved patient lives, its reasonableness would be difficult to challenge. That was 2018. How things have changed. As was the case in that Sioux area hospital, the earlier one in Ontario, the arbitrator held that the evidence supporting this masking mandate, this vaccinate or mask mandate, was, quote, insufficient, inadequate, and completely unpersuasive. And the arbitrator, in that case, it was arbitrator Bill Kaplan, he found that the masks were not an effective means of source control to reduce and stop the transmission of the influenza virus. And again, how things have changed. And also, fast forward a couple of years to March of 2020, where are all the masks? So, the key takeaways here, we believe that, the St. Peter's and the St. Mike's cases, particularly in Ontario, they could have been decided differently in a couple of different contexts. Number one, if they had a regulator that was saying this is a good thing, BC, CDC, PHO, PHAC, one of these regulators, saying this is a good thing, it's a great idea. These cases, we believe, would have been decided differently. Another reason that we think these cases might have been decided differently is considering the context of COVID-19. We talked earlier about a framework of vaccinate and mask today in the context of COVID-19, because masking in some contexts, cannot fully arrest the spread of COVID-19. It's a part of an overall, a broader health and safety strategy to stop the spread of highly infectious and deadly disease. And so, they considered these issues narrowly from the standpoint of the law at that point in time. But in our view, the laws and the frame of reference particularly has changed. And so we think that the case law, the existing case law, is of limited use going forward. And we are waiting for the next steps to be taken with respect to cases going forward to determine what an employer's limits and what the employer will be able to do in terms of a policy. I will pass on to my colleague Chris Andre. Chris, I'll just do a very brief introduction, if that's okay, and I'll just kind of highlight one piece that you're going to be covering off. We're starting to look into requirements with respect to what the theoretical risks are of a mandatory vaccination policy. And Chris has been at the forefront of this. We have been discussing this since the first instances of COVID-19 vaccinations were announced in Q4 of 2020. So Chris, maybe I can hand it off to you at this stage.
Great, thanks, Tushar. Folks, welcome. It's nice to see at least numbers. I don't see a lot of faces because of the way we're set up, but it's nice to see that there's lots of folks coming out. Here we are, excuse me, 14 months in and still suffering stay-at-home orders and whatnot. So it's a little disappointing that way, but it's nice to gather together. What Tushar and Jeff were trying to avoid is Tushar is the young, smart, completely up to date, and I am the old and have some history behind me. And Tushar mentioned, we were looking at these issues early on. I remember in February of 2020, we were talking about this was going to be SARS 2.0, and because I'm old enough to remember SARS, and as it turned out, that whole plan went in the first week of the pandemic. So we've been catching up ever since. What I'm going to talk about are some of the risks of a mandatory vaccination policy, and there are several. But the starting point for this issue really is, what are we asking people to do? And we talk about vaccination, etc. But when we boil it down, what we're really asking people to do is undergo a medical procedure, to forego the integrity of their own body in favor of what many believe to be a sound medical approach for the good of themselves, certainly, and that sometimes is lost on folks, and for the good of sort of the community. But at its base, what we're asking people to do is undergo a medical procedure. And so consequently, the test to require that to happen is going to be very, very high. And of course, because we have different folks in different situations, the ability to justify the requirement to undergo that medical procedure will vary. And so in our view, the way I think you can think of it is a sort of spectrum. And the more congregate the setting, the more exposure people have to other people, the higher the risk, therefore the higher the need for vaccinations in order to allow folks to work together in a workplace. And to give you some examples of what those situations may be, if you put at one end healthcare, so hospitals, and right next to them would be long-term care homes, and we've all seen what the consequence of the failure to control the outbreaks are in those settings. And then you move along that spectrum, and we're certainly aware of food processing as another workplace in which there's a substantial amount of transmission, a lot of illness, and unfortunately a lot of deaths. Then you move to, again, along that spectrum, to a retail context. You certainly have people coming and going from a retail context, but it's not necessarily the same close contact. It's not necessarily the same sustained close contact. And then you sort of probably at the other end of the spectrum are an office environment where there is less or no involvement of people from quote unquote the outside, whether they be customers or visitors of whatever description, and you are able to control the amount of exposure and the amount of sustained exposure that people have as they're in that setting. So the ability to justify a mandatory vaccination policy is going to be heavily influenced by the environment in which you are trying to implement the policy. The other thing that everybody needs to recognize is in the vast majority of situations, you're going to have a blended or a hybrid operation. So let's look at the food processing as an example. You're going to have the production area where people may be elbow to elbow as they're doing their work for their entire shift, subject to breaks, etc. And there really isn't as available the opportunity to socially distance, to put 6 feet between folks. And then you look at the other portions of that business where you've got the business office, let's call it, where it is the same as any other sort of office context. You don't have people coming and going, customers, etc., visitors coming and going. And so it is easier to maintain that social distance, to isolate people. Maybe people have offices, like individual enclosed offices that they can be in. And so I don't think that people can be saying, you know, we are in the food processing business and we are going to have a mandatory vaccination policy at our business. I think as you are thinking of whether we're going to have this kind of policy or not, I think you have to be recognizing that there are different parts of your business. And so you're going to have to be taking into account, do we require the folks out on the production floor to be vaccinated? Do we require folks in the office environment to be vaccinated, particularly those who are perhaps operating in an enclosed single office? So those are factors that I think we need to consider as we are doing the analysis. If you can switch to the next slide. And so the next stage that we want to look at, and everybody will be familiar with this concept, and that is the human rights risks under the Ontario Human Rights Code. There are several identifiable bases upon which people can reject compliance with a mandatory vaccination policy if it exists. The first would be physical reasons. And it's not necessarily a disability, because we're not going to consider someone necessarily disabled because they are, it is unsafe for them to receive a vaccination. But certainly that is the sort of concept or the bubble in which we are trying to consider the issue. So there are some people who will be allergic to the vaccination. There will be some people who are pregnant women may resist the vaccination based upon, the science isn't there yet to confirm that their fetus will be safe from negative adverse effects of a vaccination. So there are going to be folks who are likely going to refuse to participate in a mandatory vaccination policy for physical reasons. The second basis upon which folks may resist vaccination is for religious reasons. And people sort of, I think, have an outsized perception of the number of people who may fit within the sort of religious objection. I looked at a couple of sources in preparing these materials and found that it was a very small group of religions who, as far as I can tell, are formally opposed to vaccinations. One would be the Dutch Reformed Church. The others would be faith healing. And faith healing denominations, generally speaking, and I'm sure I'm not giving it its proper scope, but it is, the way I understood it, the power of prayer and intense prayer can resolve physical issues, illnesses, etc. And consequently, the folks who participate in those denominations resist outside influence, whether it's medication, vaccination, etc., to resolve those issues. The bases upon which some folks are resisting as well is how vaccinations originated. And again, I had to do a little bit of reading here to understand. And it appears as though back in the 70s, some of the vaccinations, and at that time, I believe it was polio that was being addressed through vaccination, was some aborted fetus cells were used to help develop one of the first vaccines. And again, I'm not a chemist, but those cells were maintained and have been reproduced and used over and over again, or vaccines have sort of originated from that original vaccine and have propagated through and been used for other vaccines as things have developed. And so there are some folks, particularly those denominations that hold a strongly held view against abortion, are in some cases resisting the use of vaccines because they originated from this source, which they in their religion are opposed to. The reading that I did, the most obvious or one of the largest groups, the Catholic Church, is formally in favor of vaccinations. But there are certainly other Christian denominations who are not for this reason. So there's a second basis of risk, which is religious. I don't know how many folks are actually going to take that position, but that is to be determined. A third basis upon which folks may come forward and resist is that they have a strongly held view against vaccination. And it's not unique to the COVID-19 vaccination, rather it's a more broader opposition to vaccination. And so, I'm not going to use a pejorative term, but there are folks who are anti-vaccination. And so you may find people who are resisting on that basis. Certainly everyone has heard of the I'm not entirely sure what to call it, the movement referred as QAnon, and there is some suggestion that the vaccine is being administered not for the health of people, but to further an agenda of a certain group of people perceived as rich and powerful in the US. And so you may find that people are resisting on that basis. What I wanted to address on that last point is, does that fall within the human rights context? Is a strongly held view against vaccination something that is protected under the Human Rights Code? From our perspective, the answer is no. And the answer is no because it does not satisfy the definition of creed, which is one of the protected grounds under the Human Rights Code. And I'll read you the Ontario Human Rights Commission's definition of creed, which is, there are several points, but one of them is it addresses the ultimate questions of human existence, including ideas about life, purpose, death, and the existence or non-existence of a creator and or a higher or different order of existence. So from our perspective, a strongly held view against vaccination does not satisfy that definition and would not fall within the scope of creed, and therefore is not a protected ground of discrimination under the code. The next slide, please. So now we'll talk about any discussion, as you all know, around human rights issues requires a discussion around accommodation. And so just to remind, even though I'm sure it's seared into your brain with all the efforts that you have to make on an ongoing basis, is that accommodation, the test for accommodation is undue hardship, which is a very high bar to satisfy. It's impossible, but it's nearing impossibility. And it's certainly, as a reminder, it is not inconvenience. It is not inconsistency between one group of employees and another. It is not inefficiency in how we run our operations and how we might be able to gain efficiencies if we didn't have to accommodate. And it is not that it is going to cost more. If it is so costly as to be disproportionate, then there is an argument that you can avoid accommodation. But generally speaking, the bar, the test is very high to meet the accommodation undue hardship standard. So let's talk about B4, which is a bona fide occupational requirement. And there may be some, you in your operations are going to have to analyze that to determine whether you may be able to satisfy that test. So to give you an example, in order to perform their duties, an employee must travel. And practically speaking, they must travel on an airline or on an airplane or on a train to get to where they're going in order to do their job. And the airline requires vaccination, proof of vaccination, or the train business requires proof of vaccination. That can be a bona fide occupational requirement, which you may not be able to accommodate and allow the employee to perform their duties. That is going to be a difficult argument to make because we have been performing duties. Presumably that person has been performing their duties for the last, at least portion of the last 16 months, 14 months. And so it's going to be difficult to establish that, but that may be one basis. What I do want to, however, caution folks against is an argument that this person is a salesperson. We need them to go to the customer's location. This person is a service person. We need them to go to the service. We need to go to the customer's location to provide the service. And the customer refuses to allow anyone into their workplace that isn't vaccinated. Well, you can argue that that is a B4, but it is important that everyone recognize that discriminatory behavior on the part of your customer does not permit you as the employer to engage in discrimination. There are certainly cases out there where a customer has behaved in a discriminatory manner. The employer of the employee has then sort of adopted that approach and sort of shrugged and held up their hands and said, I'm sorry, we can't we can't put you in that position, or we can't allow you to do the work, and both have been held to have breached the Human Rights Code. So it is important to recognize that that does not provide you with sufficient cover for engaging in discriminatory behavior. Another issue that we need to recognize and is yet to really be tested, and that is, under the definition of accommodation in the Human Rights Code, one of the factors that is to be taken into account is health and safety issues. And so we may have more leeway as employers to address or require the kinds of vaccination policies that we're considering, and something to really pin our argument to. But it's yet to be determined whether that is going to be sufficient. The other thing that we always want to recognize when we're dealing with accommodation is the fact that employees have a duty to cooperate with the accommodation requirements. And that would require them to disclose, among other things, their status as vaccinated or not. And if not, and they're seeking an accommodation, the basis for their seeking of the accommodation. So they're going to have to disclose to you precisely why it is that they are refusing to participate in a mandatory vaccination policy, assuming that that's what you've implemented. And so they're going to have to disclose that they are of this particular religion, or they have this particular strongly held view, or they have this particular medical condition that is requiring them to reject vaccination. So that is a basis upon which to engage in an exchange with the employee to see whether we can test that. Other issues that you want to consider are privacy issues. You are gathering, once you've gained that information, you're gathering very highly sensitive information. So you're going to have to consider the collection, storage, use, disclosure, destruction of that information. Can you move to the next slide, please? Another risk beyond the human rights risk is a constructive dismissal risk. And this deals with, what are the consequences of a refusal to vaccinate or provide proof of vaccination? What we are getting from clients is sort of, well, we're not going to require the disclosure of, or we're not going to require them to get a vaccination. We're only going to ask them, do you have a vaccination or not? And the answer is not, okay, well, maybe you can ask the question, but what's the consequence of the answer? And so if the consequence of the answer is denial of access to the workplace, well, then you have a mandatory vaccination policy. And so it is important for people to recognize, what is it that we are implementing. We can't simply say we don't have a policy, but we're denying people access to the workplace. Other ways of addressing or consequences of a failure to comply with such a policy include denial of attendance on customers. Well, that would severely affect those that are in a sales role. Presumably they are compensated, at least in part, based upon their ability to sell. And if they're being denied access to visits with customers, that's going to affect their compensation. They're also presumably going to be assessed on their performance. And if they're not selling at the pace that they might otherwise, if there are negative consequences to the failure to sell because they are restricted in how many customers they can visit or the way that they can visit with customers, is that effectively a mandatory vaccination policy? Another consequence is, the requirement to wear PPE. We have, in many cases, we've talked about shaming, public shaming or workplace shaming, and so those are going to be issues. If you look at the opportunities, you may not, or the business may decide that it doesn't want someone attending on customers who's wearing a mask, because that does not instill confidence, and maybe the customer won't be as open to the sales that they might otherwise be. Attendance at trade shows. Are you denying people the opportunity to attend trade shows or attend group meetings or whatever because of your policy? those that are vaccinated can go, those that are not vaccinated cannot go. And what is the consequence to them? Are they hampered in their ability to move through the company in terms of opportunities? It may also be a socializing stigma or shaming. So you're having team meetings or team functions, and the person who is not vaccinated cannot attend those. So there is a consequence there that may be indirect, but may negatively affect their ability to succeed in the company. And so are they going to claim that because you are effectively excluding them from those opportunities, that they have been hampered, and therefore it amounts to a constructive dismissal? Requirement to social distance, same argument. You got everyone around the table looking at a screen or looking at a document or looking at and then you've got one person at the other end of the table who's not vaccinated and therefore cannot participate in that activity, and they're being isolated. The flip side of this a little bit is a work refusal under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So you've got vaccinated employees who are in the workplace, and you have an unvaccinated employee. You've made whatever accommodations it is that you've made, you've implemented whatever processes and safety measures you've implemented, but that vaccinated employee takes the position, despite the fact that they have been vaccinated, because it's not 100% effective, that they feel themselves at risk, and therefore they're going to engage in a work refusal. So there's lots of issues around that we're going to have to consider. A third risk, next slide, please. A third risk that we need to consider is tort, and so I will turn that over to Tushar to talk about.
Thank you, Chris. And so just touching briefly upon the tort risks here, I think it's really important to note that where an employee suffers a negative reaction to a vaccine, there is a possibility at this stage for civil liability under tort law, under negligence law, through the principle of vicarious liability, meaning that not primary liability as a result of the harm that's caused, but vicarious liability resulting from the actual harm itself and the steps leading up to the harm. So that's a really important piece here, because if an employer removes the ability for an employee to choose whether or not they will or will not take a vaccine, there could be implications with respect to that under law. And this is a significant piece here, because tort liability can be astronomically expensive. Here are a couple of pieces that we just want to flag as part of an ongoing analysis of this. We don't know full answers to questions with respect to what the WSIB picture looks like, because we've had some theoretical indications from the WSIB with respect to coverage of vaccination-related reactions or injuries that arise out of the context of the employment relationship. And there is some authority for this. If we look to WSIB policy, there's currently one particular policy that deals with vaccinations in the context of the tetanus vaccine. And the policy actually extends coverage with respect to workers' compensation benefits to individuals who suffer adverse reactions from the tetanus vaccine. Again, we don't have the same thing yet for purposes of COVID-19. It's a possibility, and if the WSIB were to push that across, we would be able to actually take the position as an employer that there's a bar, that the WSIA, the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act, actually bars the possibility of a civil claim or a tort claim because the employer is requiring this as part of the employment relationship. That's sort of borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. We have the tort liability picture on the one side, or WSIB on the other side. There are also a significant number of individuals and employers, who may be in attendance today, who may not be covered by the WSIB's framework. And so the tort piece would be, I would say, significantly more relevant for them. Where does the law sort of step in there? Well, we have this recently announced, pan-Canadian Vaccine Injury Support Program, or VISP. We're in the early days of the Vaccine Injury Support Program, but effectively what that program purports to set up is a no-fault compensation scheme for employers who may have had to deal with instances where an employee is, it doesn't answer the question, there we go, as to whether or not an employer will be covered in the event of an adverse reaction by an employee. It purports to cover adverse reactions full stop with respect to vaccination related to the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, the program has just been announced. They've accepted some grant funding applications as of February, and we don't have criteria and actual coverage frameworks in place in order to determine whether or not there will be crossover between the vaccine injury support program and the employment context. For instance, we don't know the critical question of if we require this as part of an employment policy, whether or not we are going to be dealing with this particular risk as part of the employment context. I'd like to touch briefly as well upon privacy risks. And there are a couple of pieces here that we'll cover off and basically just very quickly summarize, because there's a sort of a little bit of a legal vacuum as well with respect to the COVID-19 vaccines that are available now. So in Ontario, we have no private sector privacy legislation with respect to the collection, use, and disclosure of information in the context of the employment relationship. We do have some maxims, principles, and rules that come out of the common law, as well as some federal sector and public sector frameworks that we can look to. So the key principles that come out of the privacy sector pieces, particularly principles relating to consent, informed consent, collection of information only on the basis of an opt-in rather than an opt-out model. Those principles, they may inform this issue going forward. But again, we have a bit of a question mark. We have some case law in, I would say, peripherally relevant sectors. So we're talking about random drug and alcohol testing, for instance, and whether or not the collection of information relating to a particular issue has a quote unquote reasonable purpose. Ask an employment lawyer, ask an employer side lawyer, whether or not collection of proof of vaccination is reasonable in the context of COVID-19. Probably yes. The union officials, employees who may feel that this is unwarranted and an invasion of privacy, they may take the opposite position. And finally, we can touch briefly upon the charter issue of bodily integrity and individual rights. These are questions that haven't been dealt with per se in the context of the employment relationship as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. We are still dealing with, in a sense, as mentioned, this legal vacuum. And so those are ongoing questions that we're considering as we move forward. I'd like to touch upon the risk of no mandatory vaccination policy, because I think that's a little bit here and now. And we'll touch briefly upon a couple of recent changes, even just one announcement in particular with respect to Hamilton. Some of our attendees might be situated in the Hamilton public health region and may be affected by this even this week. So under the Health Promotion and Protection Act, Section 22 allows a local public health unit to implement rules, procedures, guidelines for the management of an outbreak. And so far, we have seen Toronto issue a class order. This was, I believe, just 10 days ago. We have Peel Region, it predated the Toronto class order. And then this week, we have Hamilton Public Health Unit coming out and saying, listen, we are moving along with this outbreak management strategy. We're adopting a similar framework as to what has been deployed in Toronto and Peel Region. And what are we looking at here? What are these class orders? What do they mean? The Health Promotion and Protection Act, it actually allowed a health unit to do this full stop. Before the COVID-19 pandemic was relevant or part of our vernacular. These issues came up in the past in the context of SARS and again in the context of MERS, MERS. Those were also, somewhat relevant, but nowhere near the same scale with respect to COVID-19. And so the powers of the health units to issue these types of orders, they predate the pandemic by some amount. What are these recent class orders interpreted to mean? How do we view them? We view them as not so much a change in the authorities of the health units, but a stated intention. This is basically the health unit saying, employers, workplaces, you are on notice that we will close you down if there are 5+ cases within a given 14-day period that we have reason to believe were transmitted at the workplace. 5+ cases within a 14-day period that were attributable to workplace transmission. Really significant key piece there. I'd like to just chat briefly about the 2+ cases reporting obligation. There's a distinction between the rules generally that apply with respect to the 5+ cases, which are attributable to workplace transmission, and which could lead to a closure for a minimum of 10 days or whatever period of time the health unit deems is reasonable. The 2+ cases, they don't actually have to be attributable to workplace transmission. They simply state in the relevant guidelines for each of these health unit regions, and I'll mention a variety of other health unit regions in the hotspots that are located throughout the province, that if an employer is aware of 2 or more cases that are in any way connected to the workplace, so it could be employee, could be an essential visitor, could be contractor, maintenance person, etc. 2+ cases, there's a reporting obligation. And the employer is expected to consult with the local health unit and meet the reporting obligation with respect to notifying the local health unit of these occurrences. And why does that factor into this mandatory vaccination piece? Why are we talking about this? The mere instance of 5+ cases of workplace attributable COVID-19 cases, if there's 5+ cases and an employer sends to be shut down for up to 10 days, that could have an astronomical impact on a business, particularly an SME that may already be experiencing a significant reduction in revenues due to the pandemic. If a vaccine or a vaccination policy, practically speaking, reduces the risk of transmission or allows employees to return to work at an earlier stage, could that form part of a risk mitigation strategy to reduce practical business risks going forward? That's something that we're actively tracking and considering as we go forward. Another piece to consider here is, if we don't have a clear-cut answer, so to speak, with respect to, with respect to mandatory workplace vaccination, can we have an option B? Can we do something in the meantime to sort of push this along? And we believe the answer is yes. And so that is why the employer community, the management side employment bar has been discussing the concept of a vaccination incentive in recent weeks and months. So what is a vaccination incentive? It could be paid time off, it could be lieu time, it could be some form of Starbucks gift card, something along those lines to reward an employee for effectively proving that they've been vaccinated and participating in the broader provincial health and safety scheme and to stop the spread of COVID-19. So I'll chat briefly about the recent announcement made by the province with respect to paid sick days, because again, it's a little bit more of the here and now. The province has this new framework called the Worker Income Protection Benefit. Now, that was an amendment that was put through just last week under the ESA. I'm sure you've all seen numerous clips and media stories about it. And so what does the paid sick day piece have to do with this? Well, vaccination, leaving work to attend a vaccination appointment, for instance, or dealing with a sickness or side effect, adverse effect that's related to being vaccinated. Those are issues that are actually covered off under the provincial scheme. And so in a sense, the province has effectively endorsed a form of vaccination incentive. And Ontario is not the first one. We have BC, we have Alberta, we have a couple of other provinces that have actually lined up before Ontario to provide what we're calling paid COVID vaccination leave or paid time off to go get vaccinated. And so that's a really critical piece here. We do also have the interaction between the WIPB, the Worker Income Protection Benefit, and a policy, an existing policy that gives you, some form of paid leave, some form of sick time. Well, the province has actually indicated in its preliminary resources, they're still kind of being updated, the pieces are falling into place, but they've indicated that the WIPB, generally speaking, will not stack up on top of an existing paid sick leave policy, as long as the policy covers off one of the numerous entitlement criteria that are listed off on the province's website. And so those could be leaving work in order to be vaccinated, as mentioned. They could be as a result of having to self-isolate. There are a number of bullet point criteria that are listed off. As long as the policy, the employer policy for float days or sick days or personal leave, paid time off, lieu days, as long as that policy provides pay and provides one or more, and could be applied to one or more of the provincial criteria for WIPB, the entitlement criteria, then there's really no change to an employer's status quo. And so another piece, another consideration with respect to this vaccination policy, this vaccination incentive policy potentially, that could reward employees for opting into this model. I'd like to circle back to a couple of topics related to privacy and some key pieces that Chris discussed, because when we are receiving information with respect to vaccinations and vaccination incentives, there is a duty to safeguard that information. It's personal health information. It's the same as any other doctor's note. And so appropriate safeguards need to be put in place, and appropriate consent need to be obtained in order for the employer to receive this information and to store this information and to safeguard it in an appropriate fashion. And so those items and those issues should really be thought through when you're designing a form of vaccination incentive policy. We look at a couple of other forms of incentives that are not as, let's say, commonplace as the paid time off or lieu time, or a simple cash payment of some kind, or excuse me, a cash equivalent. We have some workplaces, particularly down in the US, rah, we'll give you a t-shirt, we're going to give you a hat, we're going to give you a toque. There's in our view, especially in our particular framework, we believe there's a risk of shaming. We believe there's a risk of possibly singling individuals out. And Chris touched upon this with respect to individuals going to trade shows and having to be the only person in the room wearing a mask or something along those lines. If employees on the floor are all wearing their Yay vaccination t-shirts, and there are 2 or 3 people that are singled out as not having been provided with those incentives, let's call them, there might be an issue there. Another piece that I think is relevant to go over is the education piece, because in order to build out and in order to maximize a vaccination incentive policy, we really want to be focusing on quality education and quality information exchange. And so we have a ton of resources available with respect to the PHAC's view on vaccinations, why they're safe, Public Health Ontario, for those that are located outside of the province of Ontario, the equivalents with respect to the public health regulators in your specific region. They've all published why vaccines are safe, what are the considerations, pros and cons, etc. Those are the guiding principles with respect to education, and we would strongly urge against focusing on propaganda and focusing on sort of the 2-second news clip type approaches to education, and focusing really on the facts as the scientists and the public health educators are distributing. And finally, when managing these types of issues, when managing these types of policies and creating them, building them out, and moving them to a point where they're ready to launch, there has to be some thought given to perception of an employer's motivation here, because there's a strong possibility that the employer could be perceived as being motivated by self-interest rather than the communal welfare, and messaging needs to be really, really critical here. And in some cases, an employer may wish to look outside of the organization to have a third-party vet their communications to employees with respect to vaccination incentives, even to make sure that the perception of communal welfare is front and center, health and safety is front and center. We're focusing on the benefits that could be flowing through to employees as well as their families, as well as the broader community through stopping the spread of COVID-19, as opposed to, well, you're only doing this so that you can bring us back to work faster, or you're only doing this so we can avoid public health coming in and shutting us down, or something along those lines. And I'll turn over to Chris now for a brief discussion of practical issues in the future.
Yeah, so thanks, Tushar. So I want to talk about a few things that are likely to come up, may have already come up in your workplace, even while people are considering these issues. One of them is dishonesty about vaccination status, and that cuts both ways. The first is somebody who is not vaccinated saying that are vaccinated so that they're allowed to return to work. Well, that will be an issue of, what is the evidence that you're relying upon to confirm their vaccination status? There's all sorts of issues around that, and I'll mention a little bit about, vaccination passports or certifications or whatever in a few moments, but that will be one of the issues. Most of the time, employers are simply going to rely upon the word of the employee. Well, if an employee is not vaccinated and therefore is at higher risk of carrying the disease and transmitting it within the workplace, and then is found to have been dishonest about their status, I'm not certain yet that we're going to be able to rely on the case law that has already been established in the context of COVID-19, where an employer has a clear policy that says if you are awaiting the outcome of a test or you have reason to believe that you are potentially infected, you are supposed to stay away from the workplace, self-isolate, and then confirm through a test whether you do or do not have the virus. I don't think we can rely on that because there is no evidence, at least in the fact scenario that I'm giving you, that the person is in fact infected. Now, if they come to work lying about or being dishonest about their vaccination status and they have symptoms, so they're also lying through the screening process, et cetera, well, then I think you can be in a position where you can take very severe disciplinary action, probably termination for a cause. But absent those symptoms, what the person has been is dishonest. And we deal with dishonesty in the workplace, unfortunately, not infrequently. And so I'm not sure that we can jump to the conclusion that we have, for example, just cause to terminate employment, absent that sort of real risk of infection, real risk of the person carrying the virus and infecting others. On the flip side is those who are dishonest about their status, where they have been vaccinated, but they're telling you they have not yet been vaccinated. Those would be the folks that have really enjoyed being at home, working from home, and are just not ready to wear a belt and fancy shoes because they're used to running shoes and sweatpants. Those folks, I think we are dealing with someone who is being dishonest about their ability to come to work. We've dealt with that in the past. The fact that it's driven by COVID-19 is no different than the fact that they say they have the flu and they really went to the beach. I think that we know how to deal with those issues. So that would be one example of sort of a practical issue that I think we have to keep our eyes open for. A real risk, I think, is the fact that we're going to create two classes of employees. And in some cases, it may very well be on purpose. In other cases, it may be sort of not on purpose, but the effect is the same. So maybe it's unconscious. And that is, we are providing advantages to employees that are vaccinated, and we are imposing disadvantages on employees who are not vaccinated. And I talked earlier about opportunities with customers, opportunities for education, opportunities to attend trade shows, opportunities to visit directly with clients, et cetera. So those kinds of things, we run the risk as employers of imposing disadvantages. There may also be, certainly among certain members or some members of management, a bit of a grudge against employees for not being vaccinated, for delaying their ability to return to work to perform their duties in quote unquote the normal manner. And how is that going to manifest itself? Well, it may manifest itself in how big the raise is, whether that person gets promoted, what are the opportunities that the person gets, whether they're isolated. We're having the team meeting and the person's not able to come to the workplace because we have this policy. Well, they're isolated from that team meeting. So I talked earlier about the constructive dismissal issue, but I think we also need to recognize that there's a morale issue, there's a socialization issue, and in certain cases, as Tushar alluded to, it may lead to harassment in the workplace, where fellow employees are giving a rough ride to someone who's not wearing the t-shirt or the hat or is wearing the mask or whatever it is. And we all know that workplace harassment doesn't have to be based on a human rights ground necessarily. And so we need to be aware of those. So the other thing that may affect is sort of indirect pressure from the employer. And so, for example, we are in a situation where everybody just sort of had to work from home. For those people who can work from home, they were sort of sent home, and we'll just deal with whatever the outcome is of working from home. And so everybody is, is content to, the next slide, please. Everybody is content currently to allow or permit or be understanding of, their kids walking into their Zoom meeting, and the dogs barking, and the cats walking across the screen, and flex hours, and I got to deal with my kids' education. I got to somehow figure out how to deal with this math question. I'll just work later tonight, and you're seeing emails from people who are normally leaving the office at 4:30, and they're sending emails at 7:30 because they're trying to make up the time, etc. Many workplaces have been very flexible about that, very understanding. And I mean, I don't know how many pets I've seen on Zoom calls in the last 14 months. I think there's a point at which that willingness to accept what would, prior to COVID-19, be considered to be someone who is not focused and not serious about their work, and not, being as efficient as they could be because they're dealing with all these distractions. We're going to return to a time where those things are mandated. So you need a designated workspace in the home. We're no longer going to, accept that somebody's working from their couch and their kids are walking by, or somebody's working from the kitchen island and their kids are getting something from the fridge. And, employers are going to require employees working from home to have a designated workspace. They're going to require high quality Wi-Fi so that they can do Zooms that don't make you sound like you're a robot. And it's probably going to go further with monitoring software and protocols and checking in and etc. And hours of work and productivity. Are we requiring people to perform or produce a certain amount of volume of work? And so as those things develop, I think we run the risk of having those two different groups of employees, those that are quote unquote serious about their work, and those that are quote unquote, on a flex arrangement. And what is the employer doing when they're providing opportunities or giving incentives or providing advantages, et cetera, et cetera. And so those are things that I think employers need to consider. For example, there are occasions where people, if someone is going to be on a permanently remote working arrangement, they're getting an allowance to buy, office furniture, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the person who's working at home on a sort of hybrid arrangement, but they're working from home 3 or 4 days a week, is no less in need of an ergonomically correct workspace, because you can get carpal tunnel and bad back and sore neck and all those other things in 3 days a week, just the same as you can get it in 5 days a week. But some employers are not providing that same allowance to people who are on a hybrid arrangement that they might be for someone who is on a permanent remote working arrangement. So there are things that we need to consider. I'm just going to briefly mention vaccine passports. And passports is really a fancy word for some sort of certification that is proof of your vaccination status. And so it's not likely going to be a physical document. It's likely going to be some sort of an electronic document. And I read this morning that Canada is participating with G7, G20 to come up with some sort of a acceptable quote unquote passport to permit travel between the countries. But it could serve the purpose of certifying vaccination status for work purposes. So we will figure out what that's going to be. We will not be leading that charge as Canada. Canada will be falling in step with its more populous and more consistent and more required neighbors. So the EU, the US, presumably those are going to drive whatever this passport is going to look like. It's not likely to be Canada. Is it going to be government issued? Well, that too is yet to be determined. Vaccine passports for local purposes, for non-international travel purposes, are still probably a step away from the international travel passport. I think that we are near our end, and so we did get some questions that came in, and I can see a couple on the screen. Jeff, did you pick out any that we might be able to address?
Yeah, there are a number of questions that I'm sure will take us through our time. So I'm going to go through them. I will say for everyone listening, I will go through all the questions that came in with Chris and Tushar afterwards, and we can pick out the ones that we didn't touch upon, and we'll try to get it, reach out to you directly, to answer your questions if we don't answer them live right now. The first question, and you're going to have to forgive me because as I'm moderating the Q&A and everything, I sometimes miss bits of information that you speak to. So if I do ask a question about something that was covered, my apologies. The first one is around situations where either other employees or even clients refuse to work with someone who's not vaccinated. Is there any things that employers can do to help alleviate those situations?
I'm going to jump in on that because it sort of launches from one of the points I was talking about. It's not going to be a sort of strict yes no answer. I mean, from an employer perspective, from a business perspective, you're not likely going to be in a position or likely to want to get into a dispute with your customer. That's not generally how service providers, goods providers behave towards their customers. However, I would challenge employers to remember that if a customer said, do not send anyone to my workspace to service my products, sell my or sell goods to me, or sell services to me, or provide services to me on site, that is from a particular racial community, from a particular religious community, from a particular sexual orientation community. If a customer said that, it is likely that the employer would react and push back on the customer to say, well, no, we're not going to not send you someone because of a obviously reason that is in breach of the Human Rights Code. But if there seems to be less willingness, I think, generally speaking, for an employer to push back where someone says, well, they're not vaccinated. Well, and let's remember that one of the bases upon which the person may not be vaccinated is their disability status. It may be their religious status. And so by not pushing back on the customer the way you might when it is an obvious breach of the Human Rights Code, you may be indirectly sanctioning that kind of behavior. And so I think at the very least, you need to have a discussion with the customer in that example of why it is that they are resisting, and whether they are prepared to engage in the accommodation process that you may be required to engage in order to satisfy your obligations as the employer to allow that employee to not suffer discrimination.
Wonderful. Tushar, that sounds good to you?
Yeah, it all sounds good. Yeah, it's an interesting issue because I think at the end of the day as well, it requires a balancing. That's the only thing I'll add, right? I mean, it's a complex issue, and again, it will determine on particular facts such as the statements made and the positions taken and the variables, right? So, yeah, really interesting question.
Wonderful. This is another one that I found interesting. Not something I know a lot about or have background in, so I'm going to hope that you guys understand it almost better than I do. So, if the region of Waterloo should adopt the same stated intention to close workplaces with transmission. What about employers who operate in different regions? Like in, for example, 2 cases in Kitchener, 3 cases in Whitby. Would that trigger Section 22?
I can take that one. Jeff, the rules that apply within a specific public health unit region, they tend to be very clear that they relate to workplace premises, quote unquote, that are located or domiciled, let's say, within that particular region. And so if you've got a specific branch that's located currently in Toronto, another one in Peel, another one in Hamilton, the expectation is that each of those local branches will be aware of the local rules and will comply with the local rules. And so I would say, yes, the obligation exists to do your research. They're not going to cut you slack if you don't, and ignorance is not a defense in this case. The expectation is that the local rules will prevail.
And I think, to sort of jump in on that, it's based upon the workplace that is in that region. So if you've got 1 case in Peel and 1 case in Toronto and 1 case in Hamilton, I don't think in each one of your 3 workplaces that Tushar was referring to, I don't think there's an obligation to report in that circumstance. But I also don't think that if you've got 3 cases or 5 cases in Hamilton, you need to report in Toronto, because if your Toronto facility is not suffering from 2 or more cases, there's no obligation to report in Toronto.
Wonderful. We have a couple people asking about new hires, and if you're allowed to ask when interviewing whether a person's been vaccinated, or can you put that in the job description? Can you guys speak to that process?
I'll jump in first. I think making that a term and condition of employment is likely going to put you offside, because you are going to have to demonstrate that being vaccinated is a requirement of that job. And so if you are hiring for the first time into a new role and that job is customer facing, for example, well, then maybe you've got a higher justification based upon, the things that I talked about earlier. Whereas if you've already got 3 people performing that function, 2 of which don't need to be vaccinated, but you just want to be extra careful and hire somebody who's vaccinated, I think you're very much going to be in difficulty. Another reason that I think it's a risk is it's sort of the same as some of the prohibited questions on hiring. You cannot ask somebody, do you require accommodation, as part of the interview process. You can make the offer, and then you're, I think, obligated to then make them aware of your ability to accommodate and ask what accommodation it is that they require. But you cannot ask that question before you have made your offer, because then obviously it's going to be perceived as influencing whether or not you made the offer. So I think that would be a mistake. If, on the other hand, you have you've decided you're going to implement a mandatory vaccination policy, you are going to certainly make candidates aware of the fact that you have that mandatory vaccination policy. And then you're going to want to, if someone is aware of the policy, you make the offer, they then say they're not going to, they are not vaccinated and will not get vaccinated, then we're into the debate about, well, why is it that you can't be vaccinated, et cetera. It won't be a blanket, oh, you're not vaccinated, you're out.
Great. There's also lots of questions about kind of a vaccination support policy. So not necessarily mandating it, but putting structures in place to strongly support employees being vaccinated. Is that seen as putting undue pressure on? And then following up on that as well is also like, are there risks to having mandatory policy for rapid COVID tests?
Well, I'll jump in on the first one. And then Tushar will correct it, and hopefully the second one. On the first one, yes, there is a risk. There's always a risk of providing incentives, and Tushar talked about some of those risks. If the incentive is a T-shirt, a hat that the employee is required or encouraged or permitted to wear at the workplace, you're already creating a risk that incentives are putting undue pressure on someone. Other things that employers can do to facilitate vaccination is, and I saw one of the questions from one of our good clients that's in the daycare industry, and they said, well, we can't let people go during their shift to get a vaccination because we have to care for the children. And so what we're going to do is we're going to incentivize those people to go after hours. So it's not really paid time off because it's already time off. So is it just a cash payment? Well, perhaps. Is it some sort of other incentive? Well, perhaps. And so that is putting, anytime you're creating an incentive, you're running the risk of creating pressure. Other employers, I mean, one of the things that I think many employers are overlooking and really should be considering if they want to promote vaccinations is they should be helping their employees make the appointments. Making the appointments is a full-time job for some people. And luckily in my household, it's not my full-time job. Rather, my wife has taken that on, but she has spent hours getting us on various lists at various places, and me on one and my kids on another, and for various different reasons. And it is a monumental task to get yourself set up or registered for vaccinations. And so consequently, I think that what employers would want to consider is assisting their employees to make those arrangements. Because there are people who are not nearly as skilled as others and my wife in finding all of the potential places they can put their name on the list, or going through the process of registering for that list. Another thing that people need to consider is how are they going to get to wherever it is they need to go to get the vaccination? Maybe they have family who drive, but if they're taking public transit, that's a barrier to going and getting vaccinated. So maybe what you can do is give them a ride or arrange for a ride in whatever manner it is that is appropriate. But it's not all about time off and money to promote vaccination. It may be people are very motivated to get vaccinated. They just don't know how, or they don't have the facilities or the sort of arrangements in their personal circumstances to go and do it. So I would encourage employers to consider that. Tushar, why don't you jump in on that and on the second question?
Absolutely, yeah. That out of the box thinking is very helpful with respect to this, because I mean the situation is constantly shifting and changing. In some regions, it's very easy, streamlined, and I'll tie this into the rapid testing piece as well, because in some public health unit regions, it's a streamlined system, it's an online portal. In others, you have to call literally every pharmacy, and so anything the employer can do to speed the process along is very helpful. On the rapid testing side, the situation is a little bit different. We have a little bit more guidance from the province with respect to both the provincial antigen screening program, the PASP, as well as this new privately initiated testing framework that speaks to a third party's obligations and responsibilities when they're conducting rapid antigen testing. You're still collecting personal health information about individuals, whether they're employees or essential visitors who will be entering the workplace. But I think that the screening part of the rapid antigen screening program puts it into a different category with respect to undergoing a vaccination with possible adverse reactions versus the antigen screening program, which is effectively a preliminary positive or a preliminary negative. I think that the catch points on the antigen screening side, if an employer is looking at establishing this as part of their general workplace safety strategy and approach, is what do we do with the information? So as mentioned, there are different reporting obligations under the various public health unit regions. We were talking about that during the Section 22 class order issues. On the screening side, some public health unit regions will have this via email or via some form of a web portal where you say at the end of each day, the employer has to report all of the preliminary positives that are coming out of this program via this email or fax or whatever portal. So the rules are somewhat different with respect to each region, and the employer needs to check. And the second piece there that's significant for purposes of individuals who are being tested is what happens with that information once it is reported, right? And that needs to be captured before the individual actually undergoes the rapid antigen screening test or screening process. If an individual is preliminary positive on an antigen screening, that report goes then to the local public health unit. And if the individual does not sign up for a proper PCR screening test within a period of time, they are then presumed to be positive. So that implication ties into the employment relationship, and that needs to be addressed preferably in a form of a consent form or something along those lines, where the individual gets to consent to disclosure, authorizes the collection of that personal health information, and then as well as a storage if the employer needs to store it for a period of time in a safe and secure fashion. And those things are all kind of tied in, but long story short, there are frameworks and there are resources, significant resources available both in the provincial program and for the privately initiated side that would allow an employer to facilitate this sort of screening before entry type of approach. Oh, sorry, Jeff, we got you on mute.
Yep, sorry. And just to make sure, so some of the support policies you talked about would be acceptable practice in terms of, help setting up an appointment time, help with transportation. You would see that. Basically, the question is like, would that, having those support policies in place, would that be considered undue pressure on employees to get it done?
Well, I think from my perspective, there's sort of a consequence to every behavior. So some people are going to view it as a blessing and some people are going to view it as undue pressure. And so I don't think that you can put yourself, that you can satisfy to say, well, there's a certain way where we can avoid any perception of pressure by the employer. I don't think we're going to get to that point, because for those who have made the decision that they are not going to get a vaccination, any education information that is going their way, any offers for assistance, any requests, if you were to walk up to someone and say, just want to make sure that you're aware of our assistance that we can provide to you if you want to make a vaccination appointment, they will perceive that as pressure because they've already made the decision that they're not going to get vaccinated. And so there's nothing that you can do that would be, arguably neutral or objective that isn't going to feel like pressure on them. Right. So I think our course should be, what do we think is going to have the greatest positive impact, assuming that we believe that vaccination is a positive impact for the business, and doing it in a quote unquote reasonable fashion. I mean, as everybody knows, reasonable is another word for lawyers stay in business. What is reasonable? That's why we exist, to debate what is reasonable. So I think we've met our time. And so
Chris, I'm going to have one more question. And again, for those that didn't have their question read, please note Chris and Tushar's information. Feel free to reach out and we'll also go through the questions as well. My last question that I'd really like to pose, because I think it's interesting, is what are employers' legal risks for not implementing any kind of vaccination policy? Could they be at risk at, basically, yeah, if they don't do anything, is there a risk to the employer?
Well, Tushar, you spoke on that, so I'll let you sort of reiterate a couple of the points.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think at this stage, Chris, I mean, we don't have a regulatory risk under the OHSA that says, the Ministry of Labor can show up and say, you haven't got a policy in place, in the same way that they can come into certain workplaces and say, you're not wearing your safety shoes, right? So we don't have that back end risk in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Same story under the Reopening Ontario Act. Same story under the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act. And to the best of my knowledge, unless we get a Section 22 class order from a local health unit, somebody leading the charge there, we have the same situation with respect to the public health side. And so, if we look at that full scope, there really isn't a legal risk for not implementing this type of a policy. And that may change. We don't know the answer to that question just yet. If I had that crystal ball, I'd be much better at my job. But we don't have that answer yet. And so, we're sort of in that preliminary phase, and these are very much the early days of this discussion.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of finish on that, I think that the other piece is we have been dealing with discomfort and probably in many cases work refusals from certain employees for the last 14 months. So we have had people who believe that Sally or Tushar or whomever is not behaving properly outside of work and then is coming to work and I'm worried that they are infected, and so I don't want to work near them, next to them, with them, whatever the thing is. There are other situations where I know that those 3 folks, all ride in a car together to and from work. I know that those 4 folks go for lunch at Tim Hortons down the road in the same car every day. And, I know that so-and-so's wife has COVID or had COVID or whatever it is. We've been dealing with work refusals throughout the 14 months for those that have been operating in their workplaces. And so I don't think there's a lot that's new from that perspective in sort of the skill set that people have already developed.
Great. Thank you both, Tushar and Chris, very much for your time this morning answering the questions. I want to thank everyone that is still on the line for attending today and for the wonderful questions. As I mentioned, I will go through with Chris and Tushar and those questions that we can identify the people and be able to reach out to answer the ones that we didn't get through today. We'll go through. We will just do that. And I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day. And thank you very much again from all of us.
Thanks for coming out, folks.
Thanks, everyone.